Okay, we're going to begin our presentation. I'd like to welcome everyone to the ISO 9001-2015 Critical Points of Review during the Transition Audit Process webinar. My name is Joseph Krolikowski, and I am the Technical Director of Perry Johnson Registrars. A couple of quick notes for everybody. Excuse me. All participants are in mute, but we definitely want to take your questions. If you have a question, please use the question portion of the dashboard. We will make time for your questions at the conclusion of the presentation. Our topics for today: we're going to examine how the transition process will be handled. We do have a couple of options for you. We're going to explore the projected amount of additional audit time that will be needed. We have an in-depth review of new audit content. We'll be examining kind of an overview of how the audit to ISO 9001-2015 will differ from ISO 9001-2008. I'll have some concluding remarks, and then we will take your questions. Let's begin with how the transition will be handled. Now, we recognize that for our clients there are some preferences in terms of the timing on the transition and how you'd like to proceed with it. And so it is our desire then to meet those requests, whatever they may be. And so we will be offering transition at any part and at any point in your certification cycle. Now, the preferred approach, of course, is to transition as part of your recertification audit. This is for a few reasons. Number one, recertification audits already have additional audit time, and of course, they already have the issuance of a new certificate. However, we also recognize that some of our clients are not going to be able to do a transition through the recertification process. For example, there are clients that are going through recertification right now or will be in the next few months, and they don't feel that they're going to be fully ready for the transition process. For those clients, we are going to offer transitioning either through an annual surveillance audit, and also, if you happen to be on a semi-annual surveillance frequency, we will offer transition as part of a semi-annual surveillance audit. Now, in the case of an annual surveillance audit, we would do the transition in one step. There would be a small amount of additional time. That will vary a bit from case to case. If you choose to transition over a semi-annual surveillance, you can choose to do it over 2 consecutive semi-annual surveillances. However, our preference is that it be done in a single step. Again, there is a small amount of additional audit time. If you choose to do it over 2 consecutive semi-annual surveillances, that additional audit time would be evenly split between those 2 audits. Now, in both cases, annual or semi-annual, you would receive a revised certificate representing a revision to your existing ISO 9001-2008 certificate. So let's have a look at how this would work if it was done over a surveillance audit. Here's an example. Let's say that a ISO 9001-2008 certificate was issued in January 2016 following a recertification or stage 2 audit. And so we have an example certificate number here reflecting an issuance in January of 2016. And you'll note the expiry is September 14th of 2018. That, of course, is due to the mandatory cutoff that was established by the ISO for any ISO 9001-2008 certifications. As of September 14th, 2018, ISO 9001-2008 will cease to be a viable standard. Therefore, any certificates that are issued for 9001-2008 must bear that September 14th, 2018 expiry. So with that scenario, And let's say then that the organization completes their transition in early 2018. At that point, of course, that would be an annual, we'll go with an annual surveillance number 2. You would then receive a new certificate. It would have the same certificate number. You'll note that the cert number is the same, but it has an R1, that stands for Revision 1. You'll note that the issue date is the same, but you'll now note that the expiration date is January 14th, 2019, reflecting the full 3-year cycle of certification. So if you choose to transition during a surveillance audit, this is how it would be handled in terms of your certificate. Now, as to the projected amount of additional audit time, we have prepared a special grid to help calculate the additional audit time that's going to be needed. Now, the full measure of detail within that grid is confidential. However, we can confirm a couple of critical details. Most of the companies that are ISO certified, the average company, will require a half day of additional audit time to complete their transition audit. This is, of course, if it's done during a surveillance audit. Now, there are going to be some companies out there that will be able to complete their transition with no added time at all. Now, we have prepared a special memo on this, and this memo is available through your scheduler or sales representative. So if you are currently a PJR client, you can definitely request a copy of the transition memo, which will provide some further details. Now, as to the anticipated new audit content, we've prepared a preliminary list of key new items that will require verification during the transition audit. We're going to be going over these over the next few slides here. Okay, let's begin with section 4.1. Now in 4.1 we have kind of a grandiose statement talking about a process for determining, monitoring, and reviewing external and internal issues relevant to the purpose and strategic direction. Now, we'll start with those last two terms there, that last phrase, strategic direction. We're going to table our discussion on that for just a minute. But let's take up the issue of external and internal issues, because this is a large impact item, and this is all part of a much broader strategy for the ISO. Part of what they wanted to accomplish with this new standard was to recognize that there are a lot of things that a quality system is supposed to help accomplish, and there's a lot of purposes that it serves. And past versions of the standard, of course, placed a lot of emphasis on the requirements from customers and the inputs from customers. And obviously those are still paramount, those are very important, but it was recognized that there's more at stake, there's more at play in a quality system in terms of external and internal issues than just the things that are represented by the customer. So they put that terminology in the front end of the standard, and they've emphasized, again, the aspect of both external and internal. Now, let's jump ahead a slide and also look at Clause 4.2. And in 4.2, we have an introduction to the idea of interested parties. Now, this is kind of part and parcel of what we're talking about with internal and external issues. These two things go hand in hand. And again, understand that with interested parties, it's external and it's internal. We're talking about customers, we're talking about suppliers, we're talking about employees of the organization, and so forth. And this is intended to really to be a much larger view of what goes on within the average organization. Clause 4.2 also includes requirements that a process be in place to monitor and review information about the interested parties and identify what the requirements are. So to take these three slides together, we've talked about what are the internal, external issues, who are the interested parties, what are their requirements. From an auditing perspective, there's going to be a number of approaches that will be brought to bear in assessing these items. Now, the most important of these is going to be discussions with the leadership team, and we're going to be reviewing that a bit later in the presentation. But understand for now that we've expanded the interview with the leadership. We've made that a larger part of the audit process. Now, additionally, how do we identify requirements? Well, there's a lot of things that can be brought to bear in determining this information. There's contractual processes, design processes, and so forth. And these are areas that we already look at as part of the audit process. So we won't be doing anything dramatically different in those areas, but again, this is a new requirement, and this is going to be something that we will be asking about. How do we determine what are the internal and external issues, and how do we stay on top of things? Also from Section 4, there's a new understanding of the requirement for scope statement. You're still required, of course, to have a scope. But as auditors now, we are asked to take a little bit more of an in-depth view of the scope and determine, is it appropriate and accurate? Does it account for these external and external issues and interested parties? Is it reflective of the products and services of the organization? Now, what we've done here is we've really just put the onus on the auditors, really, to follow up on this. And we've added a question to our audit report that directs an assessment of the adequacy of the scope statement and assurance that it was rendered in the correct way. 4.3 also talks about non-applicable clauses. Now, you're no doubt aware that the phrase permissible exclusion no longer appears in the standard. It's been replaced with this more general idea of non-applicable clauses or exemptions. What's interesting about this new requirement is that technically any item within the standard can be claimed for exemption. Now, our feeling is that in practice, it's only going to be appropriate in certain circumstances. For example, companies that don't perform any design of products, or companies that don't maintain any kind of measurement devices. So in general, the exemptions are going to come from clauses 8 and 7. And in terms of how are they assessed, very similar to how we look at permissible exclusions now. Do we have a statement of what the exemptions are? Do we have a justification for those exemptions? That is pretty much exactly how we look at permissible exclusions now under 9001, 2008. Has management demonstrated that it has taken accountability of the effectiveness of the quality management system? This is one of the more interesting changes in the standard, and the larger role that management is supposed to have. And again, even kind of the subtle change that came about with the term leadership as opposed to top management. But the whole idea that leadership leads and is the true stewards of the system. So I mentioned earlier there's a larger leadership interview. We'll be reviewing that a bit later. But in addition, we'll be looking to see, are the members of leadership, are they participants? Are they participants in management review? Are they participants in resolving customer complaints? Are they participants in the corrective action process? How has that been handled? 511 continues with a subclause requiring that management assure that the quality policy and objectives are compatible with each other and also with the strategic direction of the company. There's that term, strategic direction, again. So let's explore this term now a bit more in depth. Interestingly, it's actually not a term that's been officially defined within either ISO 9001 or the support standard, ISO 9000. Now, the general consensus at present is that strategic direction relates to the organization's vision of where they want to be in the future. You hear about the mission, the vision of the organization, and the idea here is that your quality system should have goals associated with it that are certainly present tense and current, but there should be a longer term objective, a forward vision of where we want this organization to be in 6 months, in 2 years, in 5 years, and so forth. And do the goals that you have, the things that you've chosen to monitor and so forth, are these things compatible with your strategic direction? Again, that's kind of the larger idea behind this requirement. Now, in terms of how we're going to audit this, a variety of ways. We'll still be looking at management review. We'll look at business plan minutes if there happen to be business plan minutes, interviewing leadership again, and so forth. 511 also talks about integrating quality system requirements into business processes. Now, this was one of the more interesting and perhaps a bit complicating changes for some companies, because for a lot of organizations, accounting and things related to accounting were always considered kind of hands-off. You don't look at accounting, you don't look at those things during the audit process. Now, for the most part, that's still going to be true. However, we do feel that what's intended by this clause is that some of the administrative practices represented by ISO 9001 can be brought to bear in the business processes. So what would we be referring to? Document control. Are the documents used in the business processes subject to revision control and so forth? Record retention. Can we have assurance that business process records are retrievable, legible, and so forth? Competency. Are the people that are devoted to business processes, have they been confirmed as fully competent? So again, are we going to be digging into your accounting books and so forth? No, that's not changing. But this requirement brings with it a couple of refinements and just kind of ensuring that the best practices represented by the standard are shared company-wide. Has the organization ensured that the quality policy is available to all relevant interested parties? Now, this comes from Section 5.2. This requirement and the spirit of this requirement is really no different than what you had under 5.3 in ISO 9001-2008. The only kind of subtle change that has come about as a result of this item changing is that now the idea is that it's all relevant interested parties. And that means external interested parties as well. So how do you make your quality policy available to customers, to parent companies, to suppliers, and so forth? Now, our feeling on this is that if it's in your front entryway, if it's on your website, if it appears in your company handbook or in advertising literature, these are all ways of generally making it available. It's not a case of you need to to push it out to these parties so much as make it available. That's the wording is available. Is it generally available? Moving on to 5.3, has top management taken on the responsibility for the quality management system? Now what's interesting here is that there is no longer any reference to a management representative. And there's been some conflicting reports on this and some conflicting information. I want to emphasize a couple of key items here. First of all, the stewards of the quality system are absolutely permitted to appoint a key contact. You are free to pick someone from your management team and say, okay, you're going to be the coordinator, you're going to be responsible for getting the auditors in here, for calling the management review meeting to order, and so on and so forth. And frankly, if you want to continue to refer to this party as a management representative, that's okay too. You know, if the terminology exists, then that's completely fine. However, remember what we looked at just a few slides ago under 5.1.1. Management has to be accountable for the effectiveness of the system, and management has to be involved in the quality system. So what they're trying to put across here, the larger point of what they're trying to put across, is that the quality management system cannot and should not be dumped in one person's lap. That's hugely important that that not happen, because if it's all on one person's shoulders, how is leadership going to then be able to say that they're accountable and that they're involved? So again, if you want to have someone on your staff that you call management representative and they coordinate things, that's fine, as long as you can demonstrate that leadership is actively involved in the system and is making itself accountable. Has top management established a means to monitor if processes are delivering intended outputs? Now there's a couple of ways that this can be approached. The most obvious is through the continued analysis of KPIs and objectives. Now we already do that as part of our audit process. We also, of course, review the corrective action process. The argument can be made that if an output is not achieved, there may be a problem. And if there's a problem, there may be a corrective action brought to bear for that particular problem. So really no change in auditing methods to ascertain this particular item. Moving on to Section 6. Section 6, of course, is where we find most of the requirements that pertain to risk-based thinking, although risk as a term is used in several places within the standard. So as it pertains to risk, in 6.1.1 it says, do we have a process for risks and for determining risks? The standard is really quite strongly worded in one of the annexes. If you look at the standard in section Annex A, there's a section within the annex that talks about you're not required to have a formal process for risk management or for risk-based thinking. It's emphasized that you can integrate risk-based thinking into your existing processes, and in fact you should be integrating risk-based thinking into your existing processes. That's actually the preferred approach. Now, in terms of what we will be looking at, again, a variety of legacy activities, management review, perhaps preventive action, planning meetings, and so forth. We will be looking at these areas for proof of risk management, for proof of risk-based thinking. 6.1.2 then talks about, do we have a process in place to address the identified risks? And again, very similar things in terms of what the auditors will be looking at, but understand that when we come to audit you, part of what we're going to be asking about is how have you approached this? How do you manage the risks within your system? How do you identify the risks within your system? And my other presentation on preparing for a successful transition, one of the things that we talk about there is what are we already doing in ISO 9001-2008 that constitutes an approach to risk-based thinking and to risk management. Section 6 also includes some new requirements pertaining to quality objectives. First, are they relevant to the conformity of products, and do they enhance customer satisfaction? Now, in terms of how we're going to audit that area, no differently. We already have a specific portion of our audit report that we use for assessment of quality objectives. Now, in terms of how will you approach this? Well, you need to take a larger view of the objectives that you've put together. Now, objectives are very much a personal matter for the organizations. They help organizations improve their processes, keep tabs on their processes, and so forth. And one of the key principles that I teach people about when they're first implementing objectives is remember that these objectives are yours first and foremost. They are yours to determine what's best for us as an organization, what is most relevant for us as an organization in terms of adding value and so forth, and what's going to be best reflective of our processes. What this requirement is saying is have the objectives that you need to extract maximum value from your quality system and to monitor your processes. But make sure that at least some of your objectives are relevant to conformity of your products, and that by achieving those objectives, you'll be enhancing customer satisfaction. And frankly, I would opine that it's difficult to have objectives that are relevant and applicable that don't accomplish these things. So, okay, in addition to the relevance to products and customer satisfaction, Section 6.2 also mandates that objectives have to be analyzed to assign resources, to identify who's going to be responsible, put together a timeline, and determine what the evaluation practices are going to be. Now again, our method for reviewing this will be no different. It's still an integrated part of the audit report. In terms of your approach on this, a lot of companies choose to maintain quality objectives within an objectives table. Sometimes they're documented within the quality manual. Sometimes they're captured within the minutes of the management review meeting. Some companies have a chart for their objectives. All of these are going to continue to be fully acceptable. You just need to be sure that you have fulfilled these new named requirements. Transitioning then to Section 7, there's a couple of key items here. And the first of these is organizational knowledge. We've actually got a couple of slides for this one. Has a process been established to ensure that organizational knowledge is maintained and made available? Now this term is generally understood as knowledge specific to the organization gained through experience. You know, think about the people within your company, the senior people within your company, you know, the people that have been running machines for 20 years, the people that have been selling your products for 20 years. These are valuable people and the knowledge that they've gained through experience. Now, what the standard is saying to you is, as much as possible, if that sort of person is no longer working at the company, are there critical knowledge points that are lost by that person no longer being a part of the organization? Is there a way to retain some of that organizational knowledge. Now, we've projected that this might include things like training methods. This might include enhanced documentation, things like work instructions, production controls, enhanced quality controls. Now, the other half of organizational knowledge is, do we learn from past mistakes? Do we improve our processes when we find out that whatever it was we were doing before wasn't working as so well? Now, for this, of course, we would look to corrective action, complaint resolution, production planning, and so forth. Now, additionally, under organizational knowledge, there's some additional verbiage that says, do you have a process in place to assess your existing competencies, your existing organizational knowledge, and look to what's coming? What's coming down the road? What are the competencies that my staff are going to have to be ready for what's coming? Again, our approach to auditing this will be little change. We'll look at competency records. We will explore the management review meeting and so forth. However, as an organization, again, this is a form of risk-based thinking. What's coming down the road? What do I need to be ready for? Is my staff fully competent for what they are going to be asked to do in future? Turning our attention then to Section 8, there's a couple of new items that pertain to design inputs. And for those of you that design products or are participants in the design of products. First of all, are the design inputs, do they include standards or codes of practice that you've committed to implement? Now, this is very similar in spirit to the statutory and regulatory inputs. But again, this added verbiage is intended to kind of expand the scope of what you might be considering for this activity. Now, in terms of how this will be audited, really no different. We will continue to interview members of the design staff, look at completed projects, and so forth. Now, additionally, under 833, we have a subclause that says, do the design inputs include consideration of consequences from failure due to the nature of the products or services? Now, again, auditing methods here will be no different, but we now have the larger issue of what happens if this thing fails in the field. Now, this is going to be tempered a bit by what it is you're designing. Now, if you're designing an item that is part of a much larger functional unit, a single piece of a 500-piece assembly, your perspective on field failures is going to be somewhat limited. Now, on the other hand, if you are designing an end-user product, this is going to be much more appropriate and applicable. So again, we would be looking within the completed project, were these things considered to the extent appropriate? Section 8 also has a couple of new items pertaining to external providers. The first of these is communication to external providers on how they're going to be monitored. Now, what's interesting here is that ongoing monitoring of suppliers, as they were of course referred to in 9001-2008, that's long since been a requirement, the ongoing evaluation. Now, this added twist here is that you have to communicate this to your suppliers, to your external providers. Now, obviously, there's a lot of ways that we communicate with external providers: purchase orders, master contracts, purchase order terms and conditions, website terms and conditions, and so forth. All of these are appropriate methods for putting this information across. Now, additionally, looking at external providers, do we have controls in place for external provider property? where ownership does not transfer to the organization. Now, this is kind of an interesting expansion of the requirement from the standard that we knew as customer property. So we, under that requirement, of course, if the customer provided you with raw materials or packaging or things of this nature, and it was damaged or lost or what have you, you had to document it, you had to report it. Well, that requirement has now been expanded to external provider property as well. So, you might ask yourself, well, when is that ever going to apply? Well, there's a couple of scenarios that we were able to conceive of where this could be the case. And one of those would be, for example, let's say that you have a manufacturing process and part of what you do is powder coating. And the powder coat paint supplier sets up a paint booth for you, sets up all of the exhaust systems and so forth. And because it's so expensive, you choose to lease it from this paint company as opposed to buy it outright. That is a possible example of external provider property where the ownership does not transfer to you. And therefore, if there was damage or what have you, you would need to keep a record of it and you would need to communicate it to the external provider. Now, obviously, this is going to be of limited applicability in most cases. However, the requirement has been established. Clause 8 also has some verbiage within it that pertains to post-delivery activities. Now, obviously, post-delivery activities is limited in applicability. For most companies, there are no warranty items or things of this nature. However, our existing audit methods for reviewing contractual and planning processes and so forth will be our likely assessment. Clause 8 also has a new requirement within it that pertains to changes and planning for changes. Do we have a process in place to respond to changes in such a way to make sure that specified requirements are met? Now, our view on this is that this will be potentially handled through the corrective action process. There may be other methods, but if it's an unplanned change, it may mean that it was as a result of something that shouldn't have happened, and therefore the corrective action process would be brought to bear. Additionally, 856 mandates that you have a method for retaining documented information about the changes and who authorized it and the actions arising therein. And again, corrective actions, perhaps management review, perhaps something less formal would be used to capture these events when they occur. Turning our attention then to Section 9, there's a couple of items that have been added to the required discussion points for management review. So let's cover those kind of in rapid order here, and then we'll cover how this will be assessed. Management review is required now to include discussion on internal and external issues, including the effect on the strategic direction of the company. Management review is also required to include a discussion of external provider or supplier performance. And then finally, management review is also required to include an assessment of risk management. Now, in all cases, our assessment methods for management review are going to be exactly the same. We will still have a section within our audit report that directs the auditor to look at the management review records. Now, in terms of how you approach the management review, again, unchanged. For a lot of companies out there, what works best is to have 1 or 2 meetings a year and cover everything. That's still going to be an acceptable approach. There's other companies out there that like to take the management review in smaller bites. That will absolutely also continue to be acceptable. Just recognize that you now have 3 additional points of discussion that the management review process is required to include. That's it for the new requirements of the standard. What we're going to do now is present kind of an overview of how the audit will feel different in doing it from to ISO 9001 2015 versus ISO 9001 2008. The key differences categorically are the expanded role of leadership, risk-based thinking, and the elimination of previously required documentation. Let's start with the expanded role of leadership. Now, we've talked about this a couple of times in the presentation. As you have seen, there has been additional emphasis placed on the role of leadership within the quality management system. And as such, we had to expand those portions of the audit that deal directly with leadership. Our audit report now has 3 targeted questions that the auditors have to ask the management team. And this is something that's to be done on every audit. There will always be a leadership interview as part of the audit. And additionally, our audit report now directs auditors to ensure that leadership is directly involved in the management of the system. So we're even advising our auditors on their audit plans to include a time block for the leadership interview to make sure that it's done and that the leadership team is aware that it's going to happen. The targeted review of risk management or risk-based thinking. Now, we've already explored how 9001 2015 does not require a formal process for risk management or for risk-based thinking. We've instructed our auditors to ask about risk management and be prepared to examine whatever is presented by the auditee. Now, we presume that a number of ISO 9001 2008 methodologies will be brought to bear. Competency planning, preventive action, review of requirements, and so forth. What's going to be important here is that the organization has decided for itself what its approach to risk-based thinking is going to be and how risk-based thinking has been incorporated into its processes. That's what's going to be most critical to meet this requirement. Now, we've looked at this several times in this presentation and in others, but 9001 2015 has completely eliminated the last of the lingering requirements for procedures and the quality manual. That means that auditors cannot demand a procedure for any particular activity. They can't tell you that you should have a procedure for one item or another. Now, as an organization, if you choose to have a procedure, the content of that procedure can still be used as audit criteria. So procedures are at will. If you choose to have them, or any other documentation for that matter, quality manual, work instructions, and so forth, these things can still be looked at as part of the audit process. Now, in addition to the requirements that were brought in by 9001 2015, additionally, there are 2 key new items that are being brought in by ISO 17021 2015. Now, this standard is the standard by which PJR is assessed. This is the standard that we have to comply with. And those 2 items are, first, we are directed now to review statutory and regulatory requirements. And we've even incorporated a special section of the audit report for this to record the results of those assessments. Additionally, auditors are now being specifically directed to comment on the level of overall adherence to the spirit of the IAF Expected Outcomes publication. Let's talk about that one just a bit more. IAF Expected Outcomes is a publication of the IAF, that's the International Accreditation Forum, and who they are, just so you know, they are kind of the top of the heap in terms of certification. As a registrar, PJR is answerable to the accreditation bodies. We have to abide by ANAB and UCAS and so forth. Well, ANAB and UCAS, for their part, are answerable to the IAF. So you can think of the IAF as kind of the top of the pecking order. And what the expected outcomes document is, it's a series of key ideas pertaining to the larger picture of what a quality management system should mean for the organization that implements it. Now, I've provided the URL here. You're certainly free to read the expected outcomes document yourself, and I do encourage you to do so. In terms of the key ideas, there are 9 of them, and I've kind of presented a general overview of what those 9 key ideas are. Any good quality management system should accomplish these things for its organization. The quality management system should be suitable for the processes and products. It should ensure that there is analysis and understanding of customer needs and expectations. There should be specificity in the area of product characteristics in order to meet applicable requirements. There should be a management of the processes to achieve expected outcomes. There should be availability of resources. There should be a monitoring and control of product characteristics. There should be an overall prevention of nonconformance, and there should be appropriate actions taken when nonconformance occurs. There should be effective processes for internal audits and management review, and there should be overall monitoring, measuring, and continual improvement of the quality management system. These are all things that are intended to be accomplished when a company implements a quality management system. And so now we're asking our auditors to provide an overall assessment of, has this been accomplished by this quality management system? In terms of how an audit to ISO 9001:2015 will be the same, the key aspect of these audits is going to be that we still audit your processes. We still assess you according to the scope that you've put together, the system that you've established, and the processes that you've determined as being part of that system. Element-based auditing has been obsolete for over 15 years, and we completed our transition to process auditing over 13 years ago. We're still going to audit you the way that we always have. We're going to observe what you're doing. We're going to review documented information. We're going to interview people. We're still going to have to learn about your process. We're still going to have to do multiple lines of sampling. We still expect that you demonstrate how the requirements of the standard have been established through your processes. All of that is completely unchanged. In conclusion, PJR is ready to ensure that your organization has a smooth, successful transition to ISO 9001:2015. We're confident that for the vast majority of our clients, this transition will proceed with minimal difference from past assessments, and that you will feel that the new standard is beneficial to your company. I would like to invite you to join us for one of our other webinars. ISO 9001:2015, Preparing for a Successful Transition, is delivered on a once-monthly basis. It's an overview of the development of the standard, an update on the transition timeline. We go over the format and layout of the standard, and we have some answers to some common questions. Also, the interaction of processes and its importance to a successful audit. This is also shown once monthly. It's an exploration of the critical topic of processes and how to correctly understand them. We have many other webinars that you can learn about, and if you visit our website, there's a full list of upcoming webinars. We do invite you to keep in touch and to opt in. If you visit our website at pjr.com, at the bottom of the page, if you enter your email address and click subscribe, you'll be automatically opted in for updates on new webinars, changes to the standards, and other relevant points of information. I do thank you for your time today. I'm going to go ahead and unlock the question panel and see what kind of questions we have today. Kelly Timmons asks, what is a KPI? Well, Kelly, the term KPI is generally understood to have 2 meanings: key performance indicator, key process indicator. And for most companies, these items are considered interchangeable with their quality objectives. We're getting some questions from folks on the availability of the webinar. We will absolutely make the slides available shortly after the webinar is complete. They will be available for download. The webinar itself can be reviewed at any time. Again, shortly after it's finished, we'll have it up on our previously recorded pages. Okay. Tobrisi Gardner, I do hope I'm pronouncing that right, asks, when will implementation and registration to ISO 9001:2015 be required? Well, in terms of transitioning your system, the official cutoff for the standard is September of 2018. So any system that's certified to the 2008 standard will be a viable system through that date. Now, in terms of transitioning, the intention is that it's going to be done some months ahead of that cutoff. So spring of 2018 would be the preferred time frame for completing a successful transition. Okay, Karen Chappell asks, for clause 5.3, do organizations have to establish KPIs for each process identified, or can they use the KPIs used to measure quality objectives? Generally, the expectation is that each of your processes should have some measure of effectiveness. However, you can use one measure for multiple processes. That is considered acceptable. Anita Wilds asks, slide regarding regulatory and statutory requirements. To what exactly are you referring? We have to follow FDA regs and some state regulations. Well, Anita, the terms are quite broad, as you might imagine, statutory and regulatory. And in general, it refers to anything that is made applicable to you by a authority body. So I would say that FDA requirements are potentially going to be applicable. State regulations may potentially be applicable. We would have to look at your case a little bit more closely and determine overall applicability. Martina Frankovitz asks, will auditors expect to review documentation on external and internal issues and interested parties, or will it be solely through interviews? Should this be defined in something such as a quality manual? There is no requirement for a quality manual, and our feeling is that if this can be ascertained solely through interviews, that is acceptable. If it makes the process work overall better for you to capture it within a quality manual or within some other documentation, think in terms of what makes the process work best and work most consistently for you. Okay, a follow-up question from Ms. Wilds. Do you mean that you will need to review the FDA regs or ensure that we have specified the regs that we follow? We would look to see that you've identified applicable statutory and regulatory requirements, and then we would be sampling said requirements for implementation and ensuring that those things are being followed. Okay, we have a question from Alberto Tulode. Again, I do hope I'm pronouncing that right. Is 8.5.3 include or refer to flow downs? Okay. 8.5.3 in this instance is property belonging to customer or external providers. If you are referring to information, Alberto, again, if we're talking about intellectual property and so forth, if external provider intellectual property, yes, potentially that would be applicable. Otherwise, I may need a clarification on your question. Okay. Karen Chappell asks, will customers continue to ask for quality manuals if they are not required per the new standard? Well, Karen, what you have to bear in mind is that customers are not beholden to the ISO 9001 standard in terms of what their personal requirements are. So if you have a customer that says, I need you to show me that you have a quality manual, that applies then. And that's then represented by your customer making that a requirement. Now, my personal feeling is that, it's going to be relatively known that quality manuals are no longer required by the standard, and perhaps that will lead to less requests for the quality manual. But again, if the customer says, I want you to maintain this and make it available to me, that is an item then that would supersede the standard. David Yinger asks, is the risk-based approach considered in ISO 9001 as a system planning activity? To a point, yes. In ISO 9001-2008, probably the most direct relation to risk-based thinking was in the preventive action requirement and the whole idea of looking at potential problems and addressing them before they occurred. David Yinger also asks, does the definition of documented information include restrictions on media format and source of documented information? No, not to that extent. The general understanding of documented information is that it is communicated information and its supporting medium. So if it's a electronic rendering of documented information, if it is a hard copy, all of these would fall under the general idea of information and its supporting medium. The other thing that's important to bear in mind with documented information is that it has two contexts within the standard. You have maintained documented information and retained documented information. Any other questions I can answer today? Okay, well, I'll wish everyone a pleasant day. I do thank you for your attendance at the webinar, and have a good one.